Portal is a phenomenal game. Just about every little detail of the game works perfectly. The first half of the game is a tutorial, but the player doesn't even notice because everything is presented so seamlessly and the player's just having too much fun to realize that they're learning vital game mechanics. What follows is a bunch of great chambers that test the player on what they've learned while still teaching them about a few more elements. Then there's the devastating Gauntlet, a series of levels that requires the player to think deeply and use all the skills they've learned to make their way to the final boss. And then the final boss fight is kind of a huge disappointment. Up until this point, you've been implementing all these interesting mechanics you learned throughout the game. Momentum, timing, turrets, these glowing orbs that you need to lead to the right places. Then suddenly, we're faced with a very simple boss fight. Stand here to hit GLaDOS, get the core, destroy it, repeat. It's a really mundane set of tasks that gets pretty monotonous by the third time you have to do it. Looking back at it, it seems like a huge letdown. Where are all the things we've used up until this point? Remember when we jumped super high and shot portals? That was fun! Where's that? Why in such a great game are we built up to this potentially grand climax only to instead be given a tedious list of instructions? Games are multidimensional, and Portal's no exception. One of the reasons Portal receives so much praise is because it juggles and flawlessly executes two large aspects of gaming: gameplay and story. The overall gameplay is interesting and unique. It's innovative, open-ended, and does a fantastic job at teaching the player what to do and how to do it. Additionally, the story is told to the player in a charming, albeit surrealistic manner. GLaDOS provides us information, but her diction and tone seem to imply that not everything she says is accurate.
Cake and brief counseling will be available at the conclusion of the test.
Couple this with the strings of eerie messages left about the facility, and the player's left curious about the facade that's going on around them. We like to consider arcs when examining stories. The graph of excitement over time for a story tends to look like this. However, these types of arcs are certainly not exclusive to story. We can make a similar graph representing excitement over time relative to the gameplay. We see these peaks as moments where the game and/or story get exciting. The highest peak is the climax of the game. So let's take a step back and examine story and play as disjoint articles. It's fairly common for a game to have similar arcs for both gameplay and story. A game like The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past does this. Each boss fight tests your strengths by having you use an element you'd recently learned, proving that you'd mastered how to use that element. This is a peak in the gameplay. Similarly, the encounter with a powerful boss creature is a peak in the story. Finally, the climax occurs when you reach the final boss fight. This is simultaneously the climax of the story as well as the climax of the gameplay. This is a game where the story arc and gameplay arc coincide quite often. It's fairly common for the final boss of a game to denote both the gameplay climax as well as the story climax. Now let's return to Portal. Throughout the game, there's a fairly consistent balance of gameplay and story. As we get our feet wet with the basic mechanics of the game, we're given only very subtle hints that not everything is as it seems.
Please note that any appearance of danger is merely a device to enhance your testing experience.
The game really picks up in the 13th chamber, where we're left to our own devices to solve tests in what we perceive as a familiar environment. After all, the past 12 chambers looked fairly similar, so we're still in familiar territory. The main difference is now all the assets are at our disposal and gameplay's graph is starting to go up. Meanwhile, GLaDOS' hints as to the true nature of the facility become less subtle, allowing the story itself to pick up as well.
As part of a previously mentioned required test protocol, we can no longer lie to you. When the testing is over, you will be missed.
This continues on for the next several test chambers. The gameplay gives us new challenges to overcome, while the story foreshadows and intrigues. Finally, we find ourselves about to be killed by GLaDOS in a pit of fire. This is a huge peak in the story of the game, as all our concerns regarding what it is we're truly up against are confirmed. Right after this fire is the beginning of the Gauntlet I mentioned earlier, testing everything you've learned coming up to this point in an extravaganza of puzzles and tests. Other than a few eerie arrows and general linearity of the Gauntlet, your hands are no longer being held because you're no longer in a familiar atmosphere. You'll no longer be seeing the same kinds of doors and buttons that tell you where to go or what to do. You'll be entirely on your own. This is the climax of the gameplay, but this certainly isn't the climax of the story. Sure, the fire pit plot twist was a pretty big deal, but from this point to meeting GLaDOS, very little is being added to the story. You'll get a few lines from GLaDOS, and now and then the occasional message is left for you. But if one were to summarize the story alone, they would spend very little time talking about the events taking place between the fire pit and the GLaDOS encounter. Despite not being the boss fight itself, the road to GLaDOS is the true testament of what the players learn throughout the game in terms of mechanics. After the Gauntlet, we meet GLaDOS. This is technically the first moment we discover that she isn't even human. Sure, it's hinted at, but her visual design alone is bound to feel like a big reveal for many players. With another big plot twist on top of general tension of meeting the primary antagonist, the excitement of the story is rather high. This excitement only increases when you learn that GLaDOS is filling the room with neurotoxin, meaning you have only 6 minutes to defeat her and escape. The situation is tense and the story is at its highest peak, but the boss fight itself is, like I said, very simple. Stand here, grab that, destroy it, repeat. The process isn't exactly boring, likely as a result of the story keeping us entertained, but the level of play involved certainly fails to match the gauntlet we just overcame. We as players are very accustomed to having the climax of the story align with the climax of the gameplay. Perhaps this is why, when looking back at Portal, we feel as though the ending was sort of a letdown. But if we instead see the gauntlet as the mechanical boss fight of play, and the GLaDOS encounter as the aesthetic boss fight of story, I think there's a lot more we can get out of the game. Now, why are the story climax and play climax separated? Well, perhaps Valve was afraid of overwhelming the player. Consider the way story is presented in Portal. The story has been told almost entirely through the dialogue from GLaDOS. Both the story and the play are integral to the experience of the game. Perhaps the designers felt that the story climax and play climax best complemented each other when implemented separately. If the player was forced to solve puzzles while also dealing with the tension of the story, it might be too much to handle all at once. Perhaps this is why Portal 2 has a beat in the gameplay shortly following a huge plot twist in the middle of it, so that the player can deal with and contemplate what just happened without being forced to think too much on a difficult puzzle. You may be wondering, if they didn't want to distract from the story, then why is there a timer? Well, the timer, while certainly having a mechanical gameplay effect, plays just as important a role, if not a more important role, in the story. Without the timer, nothing would be at stake, and neither the player nor the character would have much of a motivation in taking immediate action during the climax. In conclusion, the premise of climactic play occurring during climactic story is based on the presumption that gameplay and story have to be consistent all throughout. It may not feel right since gameplay-driven stories are so common, but if we stick to that, we close ourselves off from the interesting other types of storytelling in games. The final encounter in Portal may feel disappointing by the standards we set for a final encounter, but the choice to make it that way was necessary to make possible the amazing combination of setting and storytelling that preceded it. In short, the final battle took a bullet so that the rest of the game could be a masterpiece. So no, Portal's boss fight does not suck. You just spent 7 minutes of your life watching a video that I made. How about that? Did you like it? I did. You should subscribe. I did.